Their fire crackled warmly in the hearth of the old guesthouse, casting flickering shadows on the walls and filling the room with a comforting glow. The inn, nestled near the crossroads leading to Rohan, was a favored stop for travelers and locals alike, a place where tales were exchanged over mugs of ale, and the troubles of the road were momentarily forgotten. It was a chill autumn evening, the kind that made a man grateful for a solid roof and a sturdy chair. The common room was filled with the hum of conversation, the clink of mugs and the occasional burst of laughter. Yet, at one corner table, an older man sat alone, his brow furrowed in thought, his hands wrapped tightly around a mug of ale that had long since gone cold. He was a farmer by the look of him, his weathered face and rough hands telling a story of years spent tilling the soil. But tonight, there was something in his eyes, something that spoke of a different kind of toil, a burden carried in silence. It was then that the door swung open, and a figure cloaked in grey and leaning on a tall staff entered the room. The man was known to some as Mithrandir, but most called him Gandalf, and his arrival always stirred a bit of excitement. Yet tonight he seemed more interested in a quiet seat and a warm meal than in tales of far-off lands or grand adventures. By chance, or perhaps by fate, Gandalf found his way to the farmer's table. He nodded in greeting and set his staff against the wall before easing himself into the chair opposite the old man. For a time, they sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. But Gandalf, ever perceptive, soon noticed the troubled look on the farmer's face. He leaned forward slightly, his keen eyes narrowing as he studied the man. "You seem troubled, my friend," Gandalf said, his voice gentle but probing. "And I see a shadow in your eyes that has nothing to do with the darkness outside. What weighs so heavily on your mind?" The farmer looked up, startled to find the wizard's gaze upon him. He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the handle of his mug, before he let out a long, weary sigh. "It's an old tale," the farmer began, his voice low and roughened by years of disuse. "But tonight marks the anniversary of it, a night I'd rather forget if I could. Yet it clings to me like a dark cloud that won't let go." Gandalf nodded, his expression softening. "Sometimes the shadows of the past are not so easily left behind. But perhaps speaking of it will lighten your burden." The farmer took a deep breath as if steeling himself for what was to come. He glanced around the room, ensuring no one else was close enough to hear, before turning his gaze back to Gandalf. "Aye," he said quietly, "perhaps it will." And so, in the quiet of the guesthouse, with the fire crackling softly in the background, the farmer began to tell his tale. "'Twas many years ago, when I was but a younger man, though not so young as to lack sense. I was a farmer then, like my father before me, tilling the soil in a small village nestled near the borders of Fangorn Forest. Aye, that same Fangorn of which the old tales speak, where the trees whisper in the wind and shadows take strange shapes. Now I was never one for wandering far from the path, no sir. The trees of Fangorn have an ill repute, and I was a cautious man by nature. But on this particular day, my mind was troubled and my feet, as if bewitched, led me astray. I had been thinking of my crops, or perhaps of my family, I cannot rightly recall, but when I looked up, I found myself deep within the wood, far from the safety of the road. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows between the ancient trees. I realized with a sinking feeling in my gut that I knew not where I was. The familiar landmarks were gone, swallowed by the endless expanse of wood and leaf. There was no path beneath my feet, only the dark, loamy earth and the gnarled roots of the forest. I had no map, no star to guide me, and in those days, such things as crystals of farsight, or whatever they called them, were but the stuff of wizardry and not for the likes of me. I turned about, hoping to retrace my steps, and that's when I saw it. A bridge, old and forgotten, hidden away in the depths of the forest. It spanned a narrow stream, more of a creek really, but the bridge itself was a relic, ancient as the stones of Gondor, or so it seemed to me. The wood was dark with age, the planks warped and split, and the nails that held it together were rusted and bent, as if some foul weather had long tormented them. I paused, unsure whether I had crossed it in my wandering. My memory failed me, and I could not recall the sound of its creaking timbers underfoot. But there it stood, plain as day, an old sentinel in a wood long abandoned by the hands of men. Cautiously, I placed a foot upon the first plank. It groaned like an old man rising from his bed, and I quickly drew back. The thought crossed my mind to simply leap the creek and be done with it. But the water below was dark and cold, and my boots, newly purchased, were not made for such folly. Vanity and fear of the unknown kept me on the bridge. Step by step I ventured forth, the ancient wood creaking beneath my weight. The bridge held, though it protested with every step, and soon I found myself across, standing on the far bank. Relief washed over me, and I set off once more, hoping to find a path that would lead me out of that accursed place. But as I walked, the forest grew still, eerily still. The birds which had sung so sweetly earlier were silent. No squirrel chattered in the branches, no insect droned in the air. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. An unnatural silence fell over the wood, thick as a blanket and twice as suffocating. My own breath sounded loud, too loud in that oppressive quiet. A sense of dread crept over me, the kind of fear that clutches at a man's heart and squeezes it tight. I pressed on, though my pace quickened, and it was then that the stench reached me, a foul, putrid smell that turned my stomach and brought bile to my throat. It was the scent of death, but not the death of the field or the barn. No, this was something far worse, like the rot of flesh mingled with something ancient and corrupt, a scent that no man should ever have to bear. I covered my nose and forced myself onward, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But as I walked, the smell grew stronger, and with it came a sound, a wet, tearing sound like flesh being rent from bone. And then I saw it. Ahead, in the dim light that filtered through the trees, stood a figure, hunched and ghastly. At first I thought it was a man, but as I drew nearer, the truth of it chilled me to the marrow. The creature was crouched over the carcass of a deer, its hands, if they could be called such, slick with blood as it fed. Its skin was black as night, its limbs twisted and unnaturally long, ending in claws that glistened with fresh gore. Its head, bald and malformed, turned towards me, and what I saw in that face haunts me to this day. Its eyes, yellow and bloodshot, burned with a hate that no mortal could fathom. There was no humanity in those eyes, only a bottomless well of malice and hunger. Its mouth was a gaping maw of jagged teeth, stained red with the blood of its prey, and as it rose to its full height, towering over me like a shadow of death, I knew in my heart that I was facing no mere beast, but something born of the darkest nightmares. For a moment, we stood there, man and monster, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Then, as if by some unspoken signal, the creature lunged at me with a speed that defied its size. I turned and fled, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs carrying me faster than they ever had before. Behind me, I heard it give chase, its breath hot on my heels, its claws tearing at the earth as it closed the distance between us. I knew I couldn't outrun it, but desperation drove me onward. By some stroke of fortune or the will of the valor, I tripped over a root and fell just as the creature leapt at me. It sailed over my prone form and crashed into a tree, letting out a screech that curdled my blood. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. My thoughts were a jumble of terror and confusion, and all I could think of was escape. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, through the haze of fear, I saw it, the bridge, standing like a beacon of hope in the gathering gloom. I dashed towards it, the creature's foul breath hot on my neck. I didn't pause to test the bridge's strength. Instead, I leapt for it, praying it would hold just long enough. As I landed, the creature lunged again, its claws catching my boot and dragging me down. I kicked wildly, and by some miracle, my boot slipped off, leaving the creature with nothing but leather in its grasp. I scrambled across the bridge, expecting at any moment to feel those claws sink into my back. But when I reached the other side and turned, the creature had stopped. It stood at the edge of the bridge, glaring at me with those hateful eyes, but it did not follow. Instead, It let out another screech, this one filled with a fury that shook the very leaves from the trees before turning and slinking back into the shadows from whence it came. I collapsed then and there, too exhausted and terrified to care about anything but the fact that I had survived. When I awoke, the sun was rising, and the terror of the night before seemed almost like a bad dream. But the missing boot and the foul stench that still lingered in the air were proof enough that it had been all too real. I made my way out of that cursed wood, and I swore then and there never to stray from the path again. But the memory of that bridge, and the creature that dwelled in the shadows beyond it, stayed with me. A few years later, I returned to Fangorn with a jug of oil and a flint. I found the bridge easily enough, as if it had been waiting for me, and I set it ablaze. As the flames consumed the wood, I heard that screech again, echoing through the trees like a death knell. I don't know what that creature was, nor do I care to. Whether it was some ancient evil, a demon of the dark places, or something even worse, I cannot say. But I do know this: if you ever find yourself lost in the woods and you come upon an old forgotten bridge, turn back. Turn back and never look behind you, for some things are better left undisturbed, and some evils should never be faced. Now enough of my ramblings, and let us drink to safe roads and well-lit paths. May you never know the fear that once gripped this old farmer's heart, and may your journeys be free of the shadows that lurk in the dark places of the world.